I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw the orange survey stakes scattered across my back lawn like discarded matchsticks. My name is Patrick Jenkins, and I had just returned from a 3-week surveying job in Montana, working on a massive commercial development project that had kept me away from my home in Asheville, North Carolina, longer than I had planned. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my property, and as I stepped out of my truck, I could see fresh tire tracks cutting through the grass that bordered my property line with the community forest preserve. Deep ruts marred what had been pristine lawn, and my carefully placed boundary markers, the professional grade iron pins I had personally installed when I purchased this property 2 years ago, were gone. Not just moved, completely removed. I stood there for a moment, my surveying equipment still in the bed of my truck, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had deliberately pulled my markers. Someone had come onto my land and erased the legal boundaries I had established. As a licensed land surveyor with 15 years of experience, I knew exactly what this meant. This was not just vandalism. This was a direct assault on property rights, something I had spent my entire career protecting for others. Walking toward the back of my 5-acre property, I could see the damage more clearly. My boundary line, which I had meticulously surveyed and marked, had been violated. The tree line that marked the edge of my land had been pushed back, and someone had erected a split rail fence at least 50 yards inside what I knew to be my legal property line. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I always kept of my original survey work. The GPS coordinates did not lie. That fence was on my land. Way on my land. "What the hell?" I muttered, pulling my field notebook from my truck. Years of training had taught me to document everything, and I immediately began taking photos, marking the GPS coordinates of the new fence line, and noting the condition of my property. The more I looked, the angrier I became. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. Someone had systematically removed my markers and claimed a significant portion of my land as their own. I was still documenting when I heard the sound of an engine. A white golf cart came bouncing across the grass, and I recognized it immediately as one of the HOA vehicles. The Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association had been a minor annoyance since I moved in, mostly concerned with mailbox colors and lawn height, but they had never directly interfered with my property. Until now, apparently. The golf cart stopped about 20 feet from me, and a woman climbed out. She was probably in her mid-50s, with blonde highlights that looked expensive, and a tennis outfit that screamed country club. Her face was already set in an expression of disapproval before she even opened her mouth. "Excuse me," she called out in a tone that made it clear she was not actually asking for permission to speak. "You cannot be back here. This is community property." I looked at her, then at my phone with its GPS coordinates, then back at her. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" "I am Patricia Carmichael, president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA board," she said, crossing her arms, "and I'm going to have to ask you to leave this area immediately. We have expanded the community green space, and residents are not permitted to trespass." I felt my jaw tighten. "This is not community green space. This is my property. I own 5 acres here, and you are standing on it right now." Patricia laughed, actually laughed like I had just told her the most ridiculous joke. "I think you are confused. Your property ends at the tree line near your house. This area has always been part of the community forest. We just finished fencing it properly last week." "Last week," I repeated slowly, "when I was out of town." "Your travel schedule is not my concern," Patricia said, her voice sharpening. "What is my concern is residents trying to claim community property as their own. I have the surveys right here." She pulled out a folder from the golf cart and waved it at me. "Professional surveys done by Greenfield Land Surveying. They confirm that this entire area is HOA property." I knew Greenfield Land Surveying. They were a hack outfit that had been sanctioned twice by the state licensing board for shoddy work. The fact that the HOA had hired them instead of a reputable firm told me everything I needed to know about how legitimate this survey was. "I would like to see those surveys," I said, keeping my voice level. Patricia clutched the folder to her chest. "I do not think so. These are official HOA documents. If you have a complaint, you can submit it in writing to the board and we will review it at our next meeting in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, I said. You took 3 acres of my land and you want me to wait 6 weeks? I did not take anything, Patricia snapped. The HOA is simply enforcing proper boundaries. If you continue to harass me, I will have no choice but to call the police for trespassing. I pulled out my wallet and extracted my business card, holding it out to her. Before you do that, you might want to look at this. Patricia snatched the card from my hand with a huff, glanced at it, and then her face went slightly pale. The card read, Patrick Jenkins, Professional Land Surveyor, North Carolina License 4892, with my company name and contact information. You are a surveyor, she said flatly. A licensed land surveyor, I corrected, with 15 years of experience, and I personally surveyed this property when I bought it 2 years ago. Those markers you pulled were not just decorative. They were legal boundary markers, placed according to the original deed description and county records. Removing them is actually a crime in North Carolina. Patricia recovered quickly, her face hardening. I do not care what your job is. The HOA survey supersedes whatever amateur work you did. This is community property, and that fence stays up. If you have a problem with it, hire a lawyer. She turned back toward her golf cart. The fence is on my property, I called after her, about 50 yards inside my legal boundary line. That means you have not just moved my markers, you have taken approximately 3 acres of my land. Patricia paused, her hand on the golf cart. Prove it, she said without turning around. I intend to, I replied. She drove off without another word, leaving me standing in the middle of my own property, looking at a fence that had no business being there. I took more photos, documented the conversation in my field notes, and then walked back to my house. This was going to require more than just a simple boundary dispute resolution. The HOA had committed theft, criminal mischief, and probably several other violations I would need to research. But unlike most homeowners who faced HOA overreach, I had the knowledge, the tools, and the license to fight back. That evening, I spread out my original survey documents on my dining room table. Everything was there, the meets and bounds description from the deed, the county records showing the property lines, my field notes from the original survey, and photographs of every boundary marker I had placed. I had been thorough because that was what the job required. I had also filed the survey with the county, making it part of the official record. The HOA could not just wish that away with a fraudulent survey from a hack company. I called my lawyer the next morning. Marcus Webb had handled the closing when I bought the property, and he was familiar with property law. His secretary put me through immediately when I explained the situation. They did what? Marcus said when I finished explaining. Patrick, are you telling me the HOA physically removed your boundary markers and erected a fence inside your property line? That is exactly what I'm telling you, I said. 3 acres, Marcus. They took 3 acres of my land. Do you have documentation? I have everything. Original survey filed with the county, photographs of the markers before I left, GPS coordinates, and new photos showing the markers removed and the fence installed. Plus, I have my conversation with Patricia Carmichael recorded in my field notes. Marcus whistled. Patrick, this is not just a civil matter. Removing survey markers is a Class 1 misdemeanor in North Carolina, and if they knowingly falsified survey information to claim your land, that could be fraud. I know, I said. What do I do first? First, we file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further alteration of the property. Second, we send a cease and desist letter to the HOA demanding they remove the fence and restore your markers. Third, we consider filing a criminal complaint with the sheriff's office. But Patrick, this is going to get expensive and messy. I am a surveyor, Marcus. My reputation depends on property boundaries being respected. If I let an HOA steal 3 acres of my land without fighting back, what kind of surveyor would I be? A poorer one, Marcus said dryly. But I understand. Let me draft the injunction and the cease and desist. Can you get me copies of all your documentation by this afternoon? I can have it to you in an hour, I said. I spent the rest of the morning scanning documents and organizing my evidence. As I worked, I realized just how badly the HOA had miscalculated. They had assumed I was just another homeowner who would accept their authority without question. They had not bothered to check property records, verify their survey, or even consider that someone might have the expertise to challenge them. It was the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked power over a community. By afternoon, I delivered everything to Marcus. He promised to have the injunction filed by the end of the business day and the cease and desist letter delivered to Patricia Carmichael by the morning. I went back home and did something I should have done immediately. I contacted the North Carolina Board of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors and filed a formal complaint against Greenfield Land Surveying for potential fraud and professional misconduct. The complaint was not frivolous. If Greenfield had conducted an actual survey, they would have found the county records, seen my filed survey, and known that the HOA's claim to the land was bogus. If they had not conducted a real survey and had simply produced documents claiming they had, that was fraud. Either way, they were going to have to answer to the state licensing board. 2 days later, Marcus called me with news. The injunction was granted. The HOA is prohibited from making any further changes to the disputed property pending resolution. I had the cease and desist delivered this morning, and I got a very angry phone call from their lawyer about an hour ago. Angry how? Angry as in threatening to countersue for harassment and claiming you are the one trespassing on HOA property. Their lawyer, some guy named Richard Denton, says they have a valid survey and they are prepared to defend it in court. Let them, I said. I want this in court. I want a judge to see what they did. Patrick, are you sure? This could take months. I have time, I said, and I have the truth on my side. What I did not tell Marcus was that I had already begun my own investigation. Over the next few days, I pulled every property record I could find for Meadowbrook Heights. The development had been built 12 years ago on what had been farmland. The original plat showed the community green space clearly marked, and my 5 acres had never been part of it. In fact, my lot was one of the few that had been sold as part of the original development, but with acreage extending into what had been farm fields. The developer had specifically excluded that land from the HOA's control, probably to make the lot more attractive to buyers. I also discovered something interesting. 3 years ago, the HOA had tried to purchase additional land from a neighboring property owner to expand the green space. The owner had refused, and there was a contentious legal battle that the HOA had lost. Looking at the maps, I realized that the 3 acres they had just taken from me was almost exactly the same size as the land they had failed to purchase. This was not a simple boundary dispute. This was the HOA taking by force what they could not acquire legally. Armed with this information, I scheduled a meeting with Marcus. When I showed him what I had found, his expression went from interested to alarmed. Patrick, this looks like a pattern of behavior. If we can show that the HOA knew they did not own this land and took it anyway, we are talking about intentional trespass, conversion, and possibly even theft by deception. That is what I thought, I said. What is our next move? We file the lawsuit, Marcus said. We sue for trespass, conversion, and damages. We demand they remove the fence, restore your markers, and compensate you for the use of your land. And we send all of this to the district attorney's office with a request that they consider criminal charges. Do it, I said. The lawsuit hit the HOA like a bomb. Within a week, I received a letter from Richard Denton offering to settle. The HOA would remove the fence if I agreed to drop all claims and sign a release. No admission of wrongdoing, no compensation, no consequences. Just a return to the status quo. I told Marcus to reject it. The HOA had not just made a mistake. They had deliberately stolen my land, and they needed to face consequences. Marcus sent back a counteroffer. Remove the fence, pay for a new professional survey by a mutually agreed surveyor, compensate me for attorney fees and damages, issue a public apology, and agree to an audit of all HOA property claims. The response was a flat no. We went to court for the preliminary hearing in late May. The courtroom in Buncombe County was smaller than I expected, but Judge Elizabeth Morrison had a reputation for being no-nonsense and fair. Both sides presented their arguments for about 20 minutes each. Marcus laid out the facts cleanly. I had a recorded survey, filed with the county, showing clear boundaries. The HOA had removed my markers and erected a fence inside those boundaries without permission. The HOA's lawyer argued that their survey showed the land was theirs and that I was trying to grab community property. Judge Morrison asked one question that told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. She looked at Richard Denton and said, "Counselor, was the defendant's survey filed with the county before or after your client's alleged survey?" Denton shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, I believe the plaintiff's survey was filed first, but our survey corrects errors in the original boundary determination." "Corrects errors," Judge Morrison repeated. "Was the plaintiff's survey performed by a licensed surveyor?" "Yes, Your Honor, but was it the plaintiff himself?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Morrison looked at me. "Mr. Jenkins, how long have you been a licensed surveyor?" I stood. 15 years, Your Honor." "And you personally surveyed this property?" "Yes, Your Honor. I used professional equipment, followed the deed description, researched the county records, and placed permanent boundary markers. The survey was filed with the county clerk's office 2 years ago." Judge Morrison turned back to Denton. "And your client's survey was performed by whom?" "Greenfield Land Surveying, Your Honor." "When?" Denton hesitated. 3 months ago, Your Honor." 3 months ago, Judge Morrison said, 2 years after Mr. Jenkins filed his survey, and based on this 3-month-old survey, your client removed Mr. Jenkins's boundary markers and erected a fence. "Your Honor, the HOA has the right to protect community property." "From whom?" Judge Morrison interrupted. "From a licensed surveyor who owns the land and filed a legal survey?" "Counselor, I'm granting the preliminary injunction. The fence comes down, and there will be no further alteration of the property until this matter is resolved. We will have a full hearing in 6 weeks. Both parties will have their surveys reviewed by an independent expert appointed by the court. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Denton said weakly. As we left the courtroom, Marcus was grinning. "That went about as well as we could have hoped. Judge Morrison does not suffer fools, and she clearly thinks the HOA acted improperly." 6 weeks, I said. "They have to leave that fence up for 6 weeks?" "Actually, no. The injunction requires them to remove it within 10 days. They cannot make changes, which means they have to return the property to its condition before they erected the fence." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was not victory yet, but it was vindication. The HOA had overplayed their hand, and now they were facing a judge who saw through their tactics. The fence came down 8 days later. I watched from my back deck as a crew arrived and dismantled the split-rail fence, loading it onto a truck. Patricia Carmichael was there, supervising with a sour expression on her face. She saw me watching and glared, but she did not approach. The fence was gone by evening, leaving only the post holes and trampled grass as evidence it had ever existed. But the HOA was not done. 2 days later, I received a notice that I was being fined $1,500 for unapproved alterations to community property. The notice claimed that I had removed HOA fencing without authorization and that I was in violation of the community covenants. It was absurd, vindictive, and probably illegal, but it told me everything I needed to know about how the HOA intended to fight this battle. I forwarded the notice to Marcus, who called me within an hour, laughing. "Patrick, they are actually helping us. Every action they take like this demonstrates malice and bad faith. Keep every piece of paper they send you. It is all evidence." The court-appointed surveyor arrived 3 weeks later. His name was David Foster, and he was a 20-year veteran who I had met at professional conferences. He was thorough, careful, and completely independent. I gave him access to all my records, and he spent 2 full days surveying the property lines, checking my work, and examining the HOA's survey documents. When he was finished, he asked to speak with me privately. "Patrick, I have to file my report with the court, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Your survey is flawless. Every marker is exactly where it should be according to the deed description and county records. The HOA's survey is garbage. It does not match the legal description, it ignores existing markers, and frankly, I do not think Greenfield actually did a survey. I think they just drew lines on a map where the HOA told them to." "Can you prove that?" I asked. "I can show that their survey does not conform to professional standards and that it contradicts the recorded deed. Whether they committed fraud is a legal question, but from a professional standpoint, their work is indefensible." David's report landed like a nuclear bomb. Filed with the court and copied to both attorneys, it systematically destroyed every claim the HOA had made. The report confirmed that my survey was accurate, that the disputed land was legally mine, and that the HOA's survey was inconsistent with established property records and professional surveying standards. David stopped just short of calling it fraud, but the implication was clear. Marcus called me the same day the report was filed. We need to talk about next steps. The HOA's position is completely destroyed. Their lawyer has to know that. I expect we will get another settlement offer, and this time, it will be real. What do you think they will offer? Probably everything we asked for, minus the public apology. They will want to make this go away quietly. The offer arrived 2 days later. The HOA would acknowledge that the land was mine, pay for David Foster's survey as the new official boundary, compensate me for attorney fees up to $10,000, and pay $5,000 in damages. No public apology, no admission of wrongdoing beyond a stipulation that the land was mine, and no agreement to audit their other property claims. I thought about it for a day. The money would cover most of my legal expenses and compensate me for my time and trouble. The boundary would be officially established, and the HOA would be ordered to stay off my land. It was a clean resolution that avoided more months of litigation, but it also let the HOA off easy. Patricia Carmichael and whoever else had been involved in this scheme would face no real consequences. They could do this to someone else, someone without my knowledge and resources, and get away with it. I told Marcus to reject the offer. I want the full hearing. I want this on the record, and I want to pursue criminal charges. Marcus sighed. Patrick, I understand the principle, but you need to think practically. The settlement gives you almost everything you want. Almost, I said, but not accountability. These people committed crimes, Marcus. They stole my land. They removed legal survey markers. They filed a fraudulent survey. If I let them buy their way out of this, what message does that send? That you are reasonable and willing to compromise. No, I said. It sends the message that if you have enough money and power, you can break the law without consequences. I am not interested in sending that message. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Okay, I will tell them the offer is rejected. But Patrick, this is going to get ugly. They are going to fight dirty. Let them, I said. I have the truth and the law on my side. The HOA's response was everything Marcus had predicted. Within a week, I received notices that I was being fined for a dozen different violations. My grass was too long. My mailbox was the wrong color. I had not submitted architectural plans for the survey stakes in my yard. My truck was parked too close to the street, and on and on. Every fine was $250, and the notices threatened legal action if I did not pay immediately. I documented everything and sent it all to Marcus. He filed a motion for harassment and requested that the court sanction the HOA for retaliatory conduct. Judge Morrison granted a hearing for the following week. The hearing was brief. Marcus presented the stack of violation notices, all dated after I rejected the settlement offer, and argued that they were clearly retaliatory. Richard Denton tried to argue that the HOA was simply enforcing its covenants, but Judge Morrison was not buying it. Counselor, are you telling me that Mr. Jenkins went from 0 violations to 12 violations in the span of 1 week, immediately after rejecting a settlement offer? Your Honor, the timing is coincidental. It is not coincidental, Judge Morrison said sharply. It is transparent retaliation. All fines against Mr. Jenkins are hereby voided. The HOA is prohibited from issuing any further violation notices to Mr. Jenkins unless they can demonstrate that the violation is legitimate and not retaliatory. If I see this behavior again, I will hold the HOA board members in contempt. Am I clear? Yes, Your Honor, Denton mumbled. As we left the courthouse, Marcus turned to me. You have officially made an enemy of the HOA. They are not going to forgive this. Good, I said, because I am not done yet. I'd been doing more research, and what I found disturbed me. The 3 acres the HOA had taken from me was not the only questionable land grab they had made. Looking at property records and comparing them to the HOA's current maps, I found at least 4 other properties where the HOA's claimed boundaries extended into private land. In one case, a homeowner had sold their property at a loss because the HOA claimed part of their backyard as common area, reducing the usable space. In another, a homeowner had been forced to remove a shed they had built on what they thought was their land, only to find out the HOA had decided that area was now part of the green space. I started reaching out to these homeowners. The first call I made was to a man named Gregory Turner, who had sold his property 3 years earlier. He was living in Charlotte now, but he remembered the dispute vividly. They just showed up one day with a survey and told me that my back fence was encroaching on HOA property, Gregory said. I had my own survey from when I bought the house, but they said theirs was more recent and more accurate. I fought them for 6 months, spent thousands on lawyers, and eventually just gave up and sold the house. Cost me at least $30,000 in value. Did they use Greenfield land surveying? I asked. There was a pause. How did you know? Because they did the same thing to me, except I am a surveyor and I know they are lying. You're kidding. I am not. I'm in the middle of a lawsuit with the HOA right now. If you are willing, your case could be part of a pattern of behavior that shows this was not a mistake. Gregory was very willing. So were 2 other homeowners I contacted. By the time I compiled all the information, I had evidence of 5 separate incidents where the HOA had used questionable surveys to claim private property as common area. In every case, Greenfield land surveying had been involved. In every case, the homeowner had either given up and sold or had been forced to surrender their land. I took everything to Marcus, who looked at the stack of documents with growing alarm. Patrick, this is not just a property dispute anymore. This is a pattern of criminal activity. The HOA and Greenfield have been systematically stealing property. I know, I said. What do we do? We go to the district attorney. This is beyond civil court now. The Buncombe County District Attorney's Office agreed to meet with us the following week. The assistant DA assigned to the case was a sharp woman named Jennifer Hayes, who listened intently as Marcus and I laid out the evidence. We showed her the 5 cases, the surveys, the property records, and the timeline of events. When we were finished, she sat back in her chair and shook her head. This is going to be a complex prosecution, she said. We would need to prove that the HOA and Greenfield knowingly falsified surveys with intent to defraud. That means demonstrating that they knew the surveys were wrong and did it anyway. I can help with that, I said. As a licensed surveyor, I can testify to the professional standards that were violated. I can also show that any competent surveyor would have found the errors. The only way these surveys could have been produced is through intentional fraud or gross negligence. Jennifer nodded. Let me review this with my boss. If we move forward, it will be a significant case. HOA board members could face criminal charges, and Greenfield could lose their license and face fraud charges. Good, I said. 3 weeks later, the DA's office announced that they were opening a criminal investigation into the Meadowbrook Heights HOA and Greenfield land surveying. The news hit the community like a shock wave. Within days, I started receiving calls and emails from other homeowners, some thanking me, others angry that I was causing trouble. The HOA sent out a frantic email claiming that the investigation was baseless and that they had always acted in the community's best interest. Patricia Carmichael was notably silent. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had hired her own lawyer, separate from the HOA's counsel. So had 2 other board members. The cracks were starting to show. The full court hearing for my lawsuit was scheduled for late July. By then, the criminal investigation was well underway, and the pressure on the HOA was immense. Richard Denton called Marcus 2 days before the hearing with a new settlement offer. The HOA would pay $50,000, acknowledge that all disputed land was mine, fund a complete re-survey of the entire community by an independent firm, and agree to an audit of all property boundaries. They would also issue a formal apology to me and the other affected homeowners. It was a significant offer, much more than the previous one. But I noticed what was missing. No criminal liability, I said to Marcus. They want to settle the civil case, but that does not make the criminal charges go away. No, it does not, Marcus agreed. The DA's investigation is independent. But Patrick, This offer gives you everything you wanted in the civil case. It compensates you, fixes the boundary problem, and forces accountability on the HOA. You should seriously consider it. I did consider it, for about 2 minutes. Then I called Marcus back. Accept the offer, but I want one more thing. I want Patricia Carmichael and the rest of the board to resign. Patrick, I do not know if we can force that. Try, I said. Make it a condition of the settlement. To my surprise, the HOA agreed. They were desperate to make the civil case go away before the criminal charges landed. The settlement was finalized a week later. I received $50,000, my property boundaries were officially established and recorded, and the HOA agreed to fund a comprehensive survey of the entire community. Patricia Carmichael and 3 other board members resigned immediately, replaced by homeowners who had been critical of the previous board's behavior. But the criminal case was just getting started. In September, the district attorney filed charges against Patricia Carmichael, 2 other former board members named Sharon Whitfield and Donald Kramer, and the owner of Greenfield Land Surveying, a man named Robert Greenfield. The charges included fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Robert Greenfield also faced professional misconduct charges from the state licensing board. The trial was scheduled for January, but I did not have to wait that long to see justice. In November, Robert Greenfield reached a plea agreement. In exchange for testifying against the HOA board members, he pleaded guilty to professional misconduct and fraud. He surrendered his surveying license permanently, paid a $100,000 fine, and received 2 years probation. His company was dissolved. Robert's testimony was devastating for Patricia and the others. He admitted that the HOA had approached him 3 years earlier with a request to adjust property boundaries to give the HOA more land. He had initially refused, but Patricia had offered him a lucrative ongoing contract to handle all HOA surveying work if he cooperated. Over the next 3 years, he had produced 5 fraudulent surveys, each one claiming private property as HOA land. He had been paid over $60,000 for the work. With Robert's testimony, the case against the board members was airtight. Patricia Carmichael tried to argue that she had relied on professional advice and did not know the surveys were fraudulent, but the prosecution showed emails where she had explicitly discussed reclaiming land from homeowners. Sharon Whitfield and Donald Kramer both pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced charges. They received probation, fines, and community service. Patricia went to trial. It lasted 3 days. I testified on the second day, explaining how my markers had been removed, how the survey had been falsified, and how any competent surveyor would have known the HOA's claims were bogus. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Morrison sentenced Patricia in February. She received 18 months in prison, 5 years probation, and was ordered to pay restitution to all affected homeowners. The judge's words during sentencing stayed with me. Ms. Carmichael, you held a position of trust in your community. Homeowners relied on you to act in their best interest. Instead, you orchestrated a scheme to steal their property for personal gain and the benefit of the HOA. You violated that trust, you violated the law, and you caused significant harm to innocent people. Your actions were not a mistake or an error in judgment. They were calculated, deliberate, and malicious. The sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes. Patricia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. I felt no satisfaction watching her go, only a sense that justice had been done. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. The community survey that the HOA funded revealed that 6 properties in total had been affected by the fraudulent surveys. In every case, the boundaries were corrected and the homeowners were compensated. The new HOA board implemented strict policies for any boundary disputes, requiring multiple independent surveys and legal review before any action could be taken. As for me, I got my 3 acres back, along with compensation that more than covered my legal fees and trouble. I also got something more valuable, a reminder of why I became a surveyor in the first place. Property rights are not abstract legal concepts. They are fundamental to people's security, their homes, and their lives. When those rights are violated, someone needs to stand up and fight back. I used part of the settlement money to install new boundary markers, professional grade monuments set in concrete that would be nearly impossible to remove. I also planted trees along the boundary line, creating a natural fence that clearly marked where my property ended and the community land began. The trees would take years to grow, but I liked the symbolism. Property boundaries are not just legal lines on a map. They are living, growing things that need to be protected and maintained. The community slowly healed from the scandal. Property values, which had dropped during the investigation, recovered. New homeowners moved in, attracted by the lower prices and the promise of an HOA that had been reformed and chastened by recent events. The new board was cautious, transparent, and responsive to homeowner concerns. They went out of their way to avoid even the appearance of overreach. I stayed in my house, continuing to work as a surveyor. The case brought me some unexpected publicity, and I found myself fielding calls from homeowners across North Carolina who were facing similar disputes with their HOAs. I helped where I could, offering advice and occasionally testifying as an expert witness. I never charged for these consultations. Having been through the experience myself, I understood the fear and frustration that came with having your property rights violated. If I could help someone else avoid that, it was worth a few hours of my time. One warm evening in April, almost exactly a year after I had first discovered the removed markers, I stood at the back of my property looking out over my 5 acres. The trees I had planted were beginning to leaf out, small green shoots pushing through brown branches. The grass had recovered from the damage caused by the fence installation and removal. My boundary markers stood solid and unmoved, exactly where they belonged. I heard footsteps and turned to see my neighbor, an elderly man named Frank Potter, who had lived in Meadowbrook Heights since it was first developed. Frank had been quietly supportive throughout the legal battle, occasionally dropping by to check on me and offer encouragement. "Evening, Patrick," Frank said, walking up to stand beside me. "Property looks good." "Thanks, Frank. It has been a long year." "That it has," Frank agreed. "You know, I never told you this, but about 5 years ago, the HOA tried something similar with my property. Nothing as blatant as what they did to you, but they wanted me to give up a strip of land along my driveway for a walking path. Said it would benefit the community." "What did you do?" "I told them no. They pushed for a while, sent me letters, threatened fines, the usual HOA nonsense, but eventually they backed off. I think they were testing to see who would fight back and who would just roll over. You were not supposed to fight back. You were supposed to accept their authority and give up your land like a good little homeowner." "Well, I am not a good little homeowner," I said. Frank laughed. "No, you are not. And thank God for that. What you did, standing up to them, going through the whole legal battle, it changed this community. People are not afraid of the HOA anymore. They know that there are limits to what the board can do, and they know that someone will push back if those limits are crossed." "I just wanted my property back," I said. "And you got it," Frank said, "but you got more than that. You got justice, not just for yourself, but for everyone else they had wronged. That matters, Patrick. That really matters." We stood in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the trees. The sky turned orange and pink, casting long shadows across the grass. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children playing, the sound of a lawnmower, the normal sounds of a community going about its evening. It was peaceful, ordinary, and exactly what I had wanted when I bought this property 2 years ago. Frank eventually said his goodbyes and headed back to his house. I stayed a while longer, thinking about everything that had happened. The fight had been exhausting, expensive, and stressful. There had been times when I questioned whether it was worth it, whether I should just take the settlement and move on. But standing there on my land, with my boundaries clearly marked and my rights secured, I knew I had made the right choice. Property rights are not given. They are claimed, defended, and sometimes fought for in court. The HOA had assumed they could take what they wanted because they had done it before, without consequences. They had assumed that a surveying license on a business card was just a credential, not a warning. They had assumed wrong. I walked back to my house as the last light faded from the sky. Inside, I made dinner, checked my emails, and reviewed the plans for a project I was starting the next week. Life went on, normal and unremarkable, exactly as it should be. The battle was over, the war was won, and my 3 acres were mine again. The final chapter of the story came in June when I received a formal letter from the North Carolina Board of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors. They had completed their investigation into greenfield land surveying and had found multiple violations of professional standards and ethics. In addition to Robert Greenfield's voluntary surrender of his license, the board had issued a report detailing the failures in his work and the harm caused to homeowners. The report was published on the board's website as a public record, serving as a warning to other surveyors about the consequences of falsifying surveys. The letter thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention and noted that my actions had protected the integrity of the surveying profession. It was a small acknowledgement, a few paragraphs in a formal letter, but it meant something. My fight had not just been about my property, it had been about maintaining the standards and ethics that made surveying a profession rather than just a job. I framed the letter and hung it in my office, next to my surveying license and the photos of my property boundaries. It was a reminder of what I had fought for and what I had won. Not just 3 acres of land, but the principle that property rights matter, that professionals have ethical obligations, and that even the most powerful HOA cannot simply take what does not belong to them. The community moved forward, forever changed by the scandal, but stronger for it. The new HOA board operated with transparency and caution, always mindful of the mistakes of their predecessors. Homeowners were more engaged, more willing to question decisions and demand accountability. It was not a perfect community, but it was a fairer one. As for Patricia Carmichael, I heard through the grapevine that she was released from prison after serving 12 months of her 18-month sentence. She moved out of state immediately upon release, seeking to escape the notoriety and shame that followed her. I felt no animosity toward her, only a sense of sadness that someone had been so willing to abuse their position and harm others for such a relatively small gain. The 3 acres she had tried to take from me had probably been worth around $75,000. For that amount, she had destroyed her reputation, served time in prison, and caused immeasurable harm to her community. I thought about the chain of events that had led to this outcome. If I had not been a surveyor, if I had not known my rights, if I had not been willing to fight, the HOA would have gotten away with it. They would have kept my 3 acres, and they would have continued to prey on other homeowners. The only thing that stopped them was knowledge, determination, and a willingness to use the legal system to enforce the law. That lesson stayed with me in all my future work. When I surveyed a property, I was not just measuring land and placing markers. I was protecting someone's rights, establishing boundaries that might one day need to be defended in court. Every measurement needed to be precise, every record needed to be thorough, and every marker needed to be placed with the understanding that it might be the only thing standing between a homeowner and someone who wanted to take their land. The professional responsibility weighed on me, but it also gave my work meaning. I was not just a technician with surveying equipment. I was a guardian of property rights, a professional whose work had real consequences for real people. The HOA had learned that lesson the hard way, and I made sure that every client I worked with understood the importance of proper surveys and clear boundaries. Years later, I would occasionally drive past the community green space that bordered my property. The HOA had eventually expanded it, but they did so the right way, purchasing land from willing sellers at fair market prices. The green space was beautiful, well-maintained, and enjoyed by the entire community. It was what it should have been from the beginning, a shared resource created through legitimate means, not stolen land taken from homeowners who did not know how to fight back. My 3 acres remained mine, marked by monuments that would last decades and protected by legal documents filed with the county. The trees I had planted along the boundary line grew taller each year, their branches reaching toward the sky, their roots digging deep into the soil. They were a living reminder of what I had fought for and what I had won. In the end, the story was simple. The HOA had pulled my boundary markers and taken 3 acres of my land. They had not known I was a licensed land surveyor with the knowledge, the tools, and the determination to fight back. They had learned that lesson in the most expensive and public way possible. And in learning that lesson, they had changed not just their own behavior, but the behavior of HOAs across the region who heard the story and decided that maybe, Just maybe respecting property rights was easier than facing the consequences of violating them. Justice had been served, property rights had been protected, and I had my land back. It was not a dramatic ending, no grand speeches or climactic confrontations. Just a surveyor standing on his property, looking at markers that were exactly where they should be, knowing that the law had worked the way it was supposed to. Sometimes, that is all the ending a story needs.